After Magnus plays b2, Viswanathan actually played a brilliant move that was actually voted the best move of the tournament. Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're analyzing Game 9 of the World Championships that took place in India in 2013 between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan. The game started with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3 and bishop b4, starting the Nimzo Indian defense. Here there's practically a dozen moves that white can play. Some of the most notable are e3, which in the last video we did, where Hans Niemann played against Sebastian Mace, we analyzed some of the possible positions, but also queen c2 is the other main line. However, Viswanathan decided to opt for a sideline variation, we could call it, which is f3. f3 looks to help with the expansion in e4, so that's what he played. Now we get d5. d5, e3, takes, and c5. Of course you cannot take this pawn, as it would be a really bad position in terms of the pawn structure. So instead Vishy took the pawn on d5, and now after e takes d5, we get e3, looking to develop the bishop. In this position, Magnus Carlsen surprised the audience with a really particular move, which is c4, which in this type of positions you usually do not want to push the c pawn, as it kind of keeps the position really still and the d pawn is really weak. So instead you usually want to play something, well, more common position would be something like castles, d3, b6, knight e2, and now bishop a6, trying to remove the weak bishop for the powerful bishop on d3. Now you might get something like castles, takes, and something like, well, developing the knight or playing something like rook e8. All these positions would be good. But yeah, instead Magnus Carlsen decided to opt for c4, closing up the position for the bishops, not allowing them to develop easily. Now we get knight e2, knight c6, g4, which might be a bit of a surprise as the king is not castled yet and it might get attacked, and also the piece coordination is not the best to overextend your pawns. However, Viswanathan had calculated this profoundly and knew it was the best move. Now we get castles, bishop g2, developing the bishop in the long diagonal, and now we get knight a5, looking to go to b3, where it would be a nice outpost and it attacks the rook and the bishop. Now we get castles, and we get knight b3. In this position we get rook a2 to avoid it from being captured, and here Magnus Carlsen expands with b5. Also, to take note, the best move in this position according to Stockfish is actually h6, and there's actually a really interesting game in this position, which is between Juri Polgar and Garry Kasparov, where Garry Kasparov went to win the game, and he sacrifices g-pawn. But in this position it's actually white who has an advantage, even though it's a pawn down, because of the open files and all the activity he has. Okay, well anyways, let's go back to the position with b5. Here we get knight g3 looking to attack on the king side, and we get a5. a5, and now g5, attacking the knight so it moves backwards, and now e4. e4 opening up the center. Here it's actually the only move that works for black, which is taking the bishop. And why is this? Well, this bishop, even though it hadn't moved, it supported the g-pawn and in future the attack, so it was really a really important piece to remove from the position. Here we get rook a6. Rook a6 is actually surprising, but since the rook is not doing anything on a8, what it does is defend laterally the position and avoid any pawn pushes. Now we get e5, closing up all the position and funneling the attack to the black king. And we get knight c7. Knight c7, f4, defending the pawn and continuing on the advance. b4, after takes, and rook takes, knight takes. Now we get f5. f5 is getting really close to the black king, and this looks really scary. Here, Magnus Carlsen, calm and collected, plays on the other side of the board with b3, continuing the pawn to advance. Now we get, queen f4, continuing to attack. And here there's actually only one move that works, and that is knight c7. And why is that? Well, if you play anything else, imagine something like this. Now you get f6, and suddenly, since there's no knight c7 to go to e8, this pawn is not protected. So this might look something like this. Well, you actually get there, but it's too slow because now the rook comes in and it's game over. Okay, so that's why instead of doing anything else, he has to play the only move in this position, which is knight c7. Okay, now we get f6, continue the same idea, and after g6 we get queen h4. Queen h4, and now we get knight e8, which is a move we talked about. This is a bit of a funny position as you look at all the pieces. And then we get queen h6. After queen h6, Magnus Carlsen plays b2. And here, the move that is played is actually voted the best move in the whole tournament, which is rook f4. Not only does it allow Magnus Carlsen to promote to a queen, which is actually the only move that works for him, but also with check. So how is Vishy and Anand gonna get rid of this check? Well, there's 4 ways. One is moving the king, which of course is absolutely disastrous, as well this diagonal is blocked and it's not going anywhere. Another one is blocking with the rook, which is even worse because, well, you move the rook here to go to h4 to give checkmate, and now you're moving it backwards, and that would be completely losing. So there's 2 practical ways that we could do. One is blocking with the knight and the other with the bishop. Let's look at blocking with the bishop first. There's only one move that works for black now, which is queen d1. Queen d1, and after rook h4 you sacrifice the queen, and after takes, the only way to stop mate is by playing bishop f5. And in this position, there's actually a really hard move to find, but it's g6, which is the only move that works. And after it takes, you pin the bishop with your rook, and here the threat that white has is playing h4, h5, and so Magnus Carlsen has to sacrifice the knight for the 2 pawns to allow for the bishop to escape. Now in this position, it's really complicated, but it looks towards to be a draw, and since Vishy and Anand had to win the game, as he had only 3 points instead of Magnus Carlsen having 5, he decided to play another position. So instead of blocking with the bishop, he decided to block with the knight. Now, you can see the elo bar is plummeting. I will explain later why this is, but now let's look at what Vishy calculated. So Vishy calculated queen d1, rook h4, sacrificing the queen again. After takes, you get knight c3. Why is this? Well, he's looking to go to c7, and how is he going to do that? Well, after something like bishop e6, here you play another stunning move, which is sacrificing the bishop on d5. And if he takes with the queen, well, you just win a queen and you're completely winning. And if he takes with the bishop, now you have knight f5, and knight e7 is completely unstoppable. Actually, well, he can't move any of the other pieces, but if something like this is played, the only move to stop mate is sacrificing the rook. And after it takes, you can just give this check, and white is completely winning. But why did the elo bar plummet? Well, there's a reason for that. Basically, if you move your knight on f1, blocking the check, there's actually a move that he missed, which is queen e1. Why? Well, because now when he goes to h4, you can just take it immediately. And after you take back, there's no attack. Magnus Carlsen is upper rook, and he can safely move his position, and there's no longer a threat. And in this position, Vishy resigned, and Magnus Carlsen became the world champion.